Hi, everyone. Welcome to our quarterly Technology and Practice webinar series. Today, we are fortunate enough to be partnering with Login VSI, and we have Nick Rintallen, a principal architect for the Citrix Consulting Services, and Mark Plettenberg, a product manager at Login VSI, joining us to cover scalability best practices. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle just mentioned, my name is Nick Rintallen, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm our principal architect in CCS, and I also manage the enterprise architecture team these days. And I've been with Citrix almost 15 years now, and one of the things I've probably been asked the most in my career is, how many users can I get on a box? Or I often will get asked by customers, what hardware should I buy, right, to support this workload or these apps? And I personally love the topic of scalability, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's webinar. And I'm really excited that it won't be just me blabbing about single server scalability or resource bottlenecks today. I'm joined by Mark Plettenberg, as Michelle said. Mark's a product manager at Login VSI based out of the Netherlands, and he might be the other person on the planet just as obsessed with scalability as me. In terms of the agenda today, I'll take just a minute to talk about why scalability is important, and then I'll turn it over to Mark to talk through some technical updates on the Login VSI front. I'll take us home and talk about how some of the latest Citrix and Microsoft releases impact single server scalability. And then before we wrap, we'll be opening it up for live Q&A. So that'll be your chance to ask us any burning performance or scalability questions, and we'll try to save at least 10 or 15 minutes for that. All right. As I mentioned, both Mark and I get the first couple questions a lot. But the scalability conversation in 2019 isn't limited to just that. These days, we're asked all the time about which cloud instances or VM types in the major public clouds are the best, for Citrix virtual apps and desktop workloads. So we'll tackle that one today and provide some recommendations there. I'm also getting asked a lot about the rule I developed exactly 2 years ago, I think, to quickly gauge single server scalability. So does that still apply today in a post, meltdown Spectre, L1 terminal fault world? Does Windows Server 2019 affect those magic multipliers? And what about the latest Citrix current releases? Does that have any impact? And they're all really good questions, and I'm going to try to address those today. All right. At this point, I'll hand it over to Mark to talk about his recent field experience with Login VSI. Mark, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So for those of you who don't know Login VSI, we're a performance company from the ground up, right? We've been involved with Citrix, I think, for the last 10 years. And we get to break a lot of Citrix environments for the purpose of identifying exactly where bottlenecks are and to make them better. So if you look at our software products, we've got three. We've got VSI, and the use case there is really simulating user behavior, doing stress tests. That's what today's focus will be about. But we also got PI if you want to keep those robot users working all the time, and AT if you want to check application compatibility. Now, all of the slides that I'm going to talk about today, where I am speaking about performance, this is the lab I'm actually using, of course, to test these environments. We're not just using Excel sheets or Nick's great rule of thumb, but we're actually simulating users on a system. In this case, my lab consists of a Cisco Hyperflex system, and for today's webinar, I've configured it in the following setup. I've got the Citrix Hypervisor, I've got virtual apps and desktops. 7.15 is the version that I've currently run my tests on. Running Windows 10 and Office 2016. Now, there are other and newer combinations possible. This is a combination I see a lot in the enterprise, so I wanted to get started with that. And if you look at what we're doing, the principle is actually relatively simple. We take user activities, typing letters, browsing the web, and we log on as many users as we think we can fit on the system. So this is where the rule of thumb comes in, right? How many users do you guess you can put on the server? And if everything works out great, all of these users will be happily working. Their log-on times will be good, application starts will be fast, and everything will work as expected. It will even scale as expected. Now, in a centralized world, what you got to think about is that if you log on too many users, it won't just affect the last few users that log on, but it will affect really all the users that are already on the system. Now, this is important to note because if we keep on pushing users, the system will break, not just for the last user, but for everyone logged on. And this is something that can happen, when you're scaling out for a new environment, and how many servers do I need, but also when you're making changes. Nick also mentioned a few horrible changes this year that are totally out of your control. Meltdown Spectre, L1TF, there's spoiler, there's bound to be new ones coming that we don't know about yet. But for sure, these exploits are new and they're still being developed. And all of these things, they can cost you performance. So how can you know how much performance that is costing you? So by simulating users, we figure out this is the maximum capacity. Not just for one server, that's the single server scalability, but also for a whole infrastructure. For example, if you have a shared storage device or domain controller, you want to know how those things react really when under stress. And the number that we're looking for is what we call the VSI max. So this is how many users can I put on a system before it breaks, before they start to notice that the system is actually becoming slower. And this is where a user would normally click, for example, the shortcut for Word, they double click, nothing would happen. They click it a few more times, and then suddenly the application starts 6 times. This is really frustrating for a user. And by stimulating that user activity, we can find those points automatically and give you a lot of feedback that the things you are doing to the system are actually good. Because there are a lot of myths out there when it comes to performance. And a lot of things that we've learned over the years that used to be valid maybe 10 years ago when I started in this industry, that are not valid anymore on the newer operating systems or the newer CPUs. So how do you know which boxes to tick and which ones to leave unticked for the best user experience? And a prime example of this is a recent case where a colleague of mine went to an airport, and this was a newly built airport, where they wanted to have 400 users on the VDI environment. Now, for us, 400 users, that's on the smaller side of VDI environments, but it's also where we start to see the cracks when it comes to not perfectly configuring everything for performance. So we came in, and the customer simply said, prove to me that I can put 400 users on this system. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. And keep in mind, they figured that everything would work out great. Of course, I'm showing you this. We didn't make the 400. We got close, 373, but it's very unfortunate if you're trying to board your plane and you're in front of the desks of one of the 27 people that could not log on to the environment anymore. And this was not because the environment, there was not sufficient hardware or they chose the wrong technology. No, all of their choices were right. Only the configuration was not perfect. So what we're looking at in this chart is a couple of things. On the horizontal axis, the number of users that I logged on to the system over time, so slowly adding more users to it. And on the vertical axis, the response time of the system. So as we add more users to the system, of course, the system becomes slower, right? This is where we at some point say the system is now too slow. You should stop adding users. In this case, at 373 users. The unfortunate thing, the customer expected to go to 400 here. So we started to look at the system. And as a little help for myself, I use this VDI tuning stack image. I start to isolate the layers that I want to dive into. So on the server, actually my colleague, he took a sneak peek and he noticed that the clients were using a lot of CPU resources. So there could be a few things in my mind that were misconfigured. The client itself, the remoting protocol, or maybe some policies. And bear in mind, these are not just the group policies for Microsoft, but also Citrix policies, right? If you're looking at competing technology, they have all of the same settings as well, of course. So looking at the system a bit further, we noticed that they set it for 60 frames per second. Now the default there is, I believe, 30 frames per second. So imagine that you're sending twice as many images every second from the server to the client. Of course, this has an impact on how much CPU you're using per user. So we asked them, why did you set that setting to 60 FPS? Their users are typical data entry users. If you've been to an airport recently, you see that they still use those applications that look like they're from the 80s. So they're definitely not using GPUs or anything fancy there. They're very simple applications, but they set it to 60 FPS. And when we challenged them, they said, well, we did it based on feedback that a consultant gave us because he always sets it that way, which is fine, but he didn't realize the impact of that setting. So we changed one thing. We changed the setting from 60 frames per second to 30 frames per second, which for their line of business applications made absolutely no difference in how they would use it. But immediately the scalability of their environment went up. So we only tested to 400 users, but if I'm looking at this chart again, with on the horizontal axis the number of users and the vertical axis the response time, I can see that I can put a lot more users on the system now. The 400 is just the start. How many exactly I can put on here? Not sure at this point, but it will be above 400. So this customer is happy. They can go live with the environment knowing that when their real persons are logging onto the system, it will work as it's designed, as they expect it to be. Now, there are many scenarios that you can do like this. And another one that some colleagues of mine recently did for a big customer in the United States is actually testing multiple clouds. Now, this is interesting because there's a lot of competition going on there, and there's a lot of things in the cloud that can impact performance. Of course, different instance types, different types of storage, right? Are you going for the HDD or the SSD drives? So what does choosing a different cloud actually mean in terms of logging on users and their experience on the system? Now, I can't name you the names in this case, but imagine these are two competitors. Maybe it's Azure, maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's another cloud. And on both sides, I've installed Citrix, right, as the desktop delivery mechanism. What I see here, and if I scale the charts the same, I see that although the performance is relatively similar with 50 users in one environment, when I only do the next finish installation, so the out-of-the-box installation, some users will not be happy, right? Why are there these spikes in my chart? These would be the things that in a production environment, when you have real users logging on with different profiles, these are really hard to figure out from their log on times and monitoring. This is really something you find out during testing, where you still have the time to set everything straight before the real users come in. But if I'd had to make a choice between different clouds based on this, I would say I would go for the cloud on the left, right? Because the performance is a lot more stable. There's not the exceptions. So let's take it from there. Or alternatively, if I want to choose the one on the right, because maybe it's cheaper or I like them more or my personnel is trained on that one, I know I have to figure out what's the problem here. Now, in this case, zooming into the log-on times, we can see that there's also a big problem there. So my ultimate guess would then, of course, rather soon be DNS. But the only way you can truly find out is typically by doing these performance tests. Now, if people are moving to the cloud, and we recently did a survey, we asked them from VDI like a pro, what are the reasons, what are the problems when you are going to the cloud? Of course, some people are having challenges with the cost. Some people are having problems with legal regulation. But the top of the list from the performance, from the list of things you can actually influence is performance of the solution. And this is the performance when it comes out of the box. But secondly, also keeping track of that performance over time. Because as Nick mentioned, we have meltdown, spectacle, L1TF. And the problem with these exploits is that a cloud hosting party needs to patch in the worst kind of way. They need to enable all of the security and trying to maintain the same level of performance for the same price for you. So at some point, they will start changing things. And whether you notice that or your real users notice that in time to prevent it going the wrong way, is the question. So that's another thing that we typically like to measure and show to our end users, like, hey, this is how performance is impacted. Another question we ask the public is, hey, are you going to the cloud already? And the answers here, they really differ per country, right? So about 20% of the respondents said, well, I'm not interested at all. And bear in mind, this is 750 IT admins from all over the world. They said no. But we're running the same survey again now, 1 year later, and these numbers are changing a lot. So a little bit of self-promotion here. We are doing the survey right now. Go to vdilikeapro.com/survey and give your feedback on what you're doing today in the industry. And all of the results will, of course, be shared back to the community. So it will take you 11 minutes of your time. We will give you a lot of perfect information back that's all being made publicly available. Another question that, of course, is very interesting for myself is the question, do people currently performance tune their environment? And I'm very happy to see that if we add manual tuning, the VMware optimizer, and the Citrix optimizer all together, most people are doing performance tuning. And I dare to go so far as saying that if you do not performance tune a VDI environment, the user experience will not be great, right? There are all of these tools out there, and there's really good products that can help you analyze a system. It's the next finish, really quick, and make the performance better. Now, how much more scalability do you get out of a server if you performance tune it or not? This is a simple example. I've got a Windows 10 VDI environment, single server scalability of 130, and I've got one that I did performance tuning on, and I get almost 145 users on the same box. So this is great, right? This tells me that I get a lot more bang for buck. Looking at scalability over time, we've tested different Windows 10 builds, and in this case, they've been optimized with the VMware optimizer. Same would go for the Citrix optimizer. These products even work cross-compatible, so you could optimize a VMware environment with the Citrix optimizer and vice versa, and they even work on your own notebook if you want to make that faster. Works really well. And we see that over time, first of all, it looks like Microsoft is making better scalability, but if we wait for version 18.03 of Windows 10, we see that single server scalability drastically goes down. And this is really due to Meltdown Inspector. With 18.09, again, we see a significant drop in performance. And this is really a change in OneDrive that has led to a performance degradation that at logon of the user would cause for indexation of the files that would not make them happy. So these are things and changes that they are just in Windows updates. And if we look at the CPU utilization of that test, and that's something we captured, so all of those virtual users are actually busy. We measure how much CPU we're using, and this is the OneDrive example, but we see from 16.07, every update that Windows 10 has had, a little deviation in CPU. Sometimes it uses less CPU, yay, very good. Sometimes it uses more CPU, and that's the 18.09 release, and that's the OneDrive logon thingy. So this is just a Windows update. Make sure that you check those things before you go live and into production. Now, if we look at the impact of going from 18.03 to 18.09 on logon times, just because of Windows updates, we see the same thing, right? Already at 70 users, it goes through the roof. Now, I'm not saying you should not upgrade, right? The only thing I'm saying is, before you upgrade your full environment, make sure you do a performance test. Start with single server and then build it up to test your full infrastructure if you're doing big changes. If you're upgrading Citrix to the latest version, if you're going from 6.5 to 7 something, make sure that you test if all of the components in your environment scale as you expected. And in theory, they all will, but in practice, sometimes you forgot that one checkbox that makes the whole process very painful. So throw a bunch of these virtual users at it and be very happy. Another thing that's interesting to note when it comes to performance that a lot of people overlook is the difference between really performance tuning for scalability and performance tuning for a better performance overall. And these are the logon times before and after patching for Meltdown Inspector. And I can see that already at one user, everything is a little bit slower, right? So this is what we call the baseline performance. And these are really things like antivirus, your storage optimizations, your storage subsystem, app layering mode, all of those things that are in the system affecting the user all the time. On the right side of the chart, where we really see the hockey stick effect and everything going up, if we want to push that out, that's really where the performance tuning tools help a lot, right? You disable default applications, you disable services. That frees memory and CPU cycles and make sure you can put more users on the server. So those are two very distinct things to look at. Workspace managers, by the way, also have a very big impact on performance if you don't configure them properly. But the biggest thing that not only I, but also we've asked everybody in the industry again, see as the most common source of performance problems are applications. And if we look at software vendors right now, most of them are adopting release cycles of 2 weeks to a month, right? So there's more applications coming into your environment. There's more updates coming. So how can you keep yourself out of trouble? So with that, I'd like to say, if you want to try this for yourself, if you want to know how many users you can put on the server, go to loginvsi.com and start testing right now. There's a free trial available. Also, make sure that, to give it a spin, right? Try not to go for one server, but make it a little bit bigger in your environment and see what happens. If you're interested in reading about this, there's, I think, more than 200 reference architectures on the same website. All of the vendors like Citrix, but also hardware partners that have outlined what their solutions can do. Keep in mind, there's a little bit of marketing involved in those papers, so they don't run antivirus. They have optimized everything. Results will vary with what you see in practice, but at least you know the maximum that you can get from those systems. So go to the website after the webinar and try it. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Nick.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Yes, it is definitely all about the apps, and I feel like I've been saying that forever. But so the apps probably represent the biggest variability when we do this type of scalability testing. But what else? Like, what are the other factors or variables, or what else has changed? I think since I published that original Rule of 5 and 10 article in early 2017, what's changed over the last couple of years? So here's a quick rundown. Obviously, in early 2018, Meltdown and Spectre really, I think, rocked everyone's world. And then later on, right, there were additional, security vulnerabilities, things like bypass and L1 terminal fault in particular, I think rocked it a little bit more. And then in late, I think it was October 2018, that's when Microsoft shipped Windows Server 2019. And the other thing, so not only that, but, I think last year we were primarily doing a lot of 2012 R2. And now we're starting to see a lot of customers make the upgrade to 2016. So that always changes things. And I have some numbers to kind of compare between 2012 R2, 2016, and then now 2019. Of course, Citrix is not asleep at the wheel. We've done lots of enhancements to not only the ICA or HTX protocol, but also the underlying encoders and algorithms inside ICA. So things like the enlightened data transport, right, moving to UDP. HTX enhancements like fuzzy first and adaptive throughput, and then new progressive display or progressive display 2.0. So all those things, play a factor, I think, as well when it comes to scalability. On the Intel side, they're shipping some pretty powerful boxes these days. At this point in time, there's a 28 core box out there. And then the other thing that's kind of, I guess, interesting that I'm going to cover in a minute is the underlying chip architecture. They've actually changed, and that has a direct kind of impact on how we size XenApp servers. And then, of course, just this week when I was wrapping up these slides, I noticed that Intel announced that they're with their new Cascade Lake advanced performance chips that I think are going to make their debut in the third quarter. They said they actually have some of these Platinum 9282s have 56 cores, if you can believe that. So it looks like they're putting a couple of those dies together. So anyways, it's about to get even, I think, crazier than it is right now. In addition, we've shipped about 7 or 8 new virtual apps and desktop releases, so a lot of new CRs, and I'll talk about the impact of those in terms of, single server scalability. Image optimization tools, Mark mentioned VMware OSOT, there's BISIF, and then we have our own Citrix Optimizer, and 2.1 actually just shipped about a week or two ago, so that's the latest and greatest if you want to grab that and check it out. And then last but not least, the cloud. Everything in the cloud's changing, literally every day. The cost models are changing. New instance types are being unveiled or debuted, and so we're constantly looking at what makes the most sense for our virtual apps and desktop workloads. So I'm going to provide some recommendations around instance types and the VM sizes for that. All right, so we've been talking about this Rule of 5 and 10, and then I wanted to quickly review it just in case you haven't seen this before. And really, like I said, I came up with this a couple of years ago after being asked this question, I feel like, a million times. And the idea was pretty simple. Like I realized there was a couple of themes every time I was like trying to provide some guidance here. And the themes were really CPU is almost always a limiting factor when it comes to XenApp or Desktop workloads. 99% of the time it's CPU. And so a lot of the oversubscription ratios and things we talk about, it's all about CPU, and that's why, because it's the bottleneck 9 times out of 10. And the other thing is the hardware that's being used, it almost has a direct correlation, right? The number of physical cores in the box to scalability. And so I kind of put those two things together, and I developed these magic multipliers. And like I said, the math is pretty simple. You basically use 5 for virtual desktops and 10 for virtual apps. And of course, your mileage is going to vary, but it's also amazing how accurate this is if you want to try it for yourself. I'll show you how this stacks up in a few slides in a little bit in terms of like real world, workloads and real world apps. How close are we actually getting to that 10 magic number? Anyways, if this is new to you, if you want to kind of read more about how these were derived, check out the last link there. That's the latest and greatest article on TechZone that I drafted up a few months ago. All right, so I mentioned that Intel changed their underlying chip and memory architecture. So let me explain that piece a bit before we move on. So on older chips like Broadwell and Haswell, Intel connected processors using a ring-based architecture. But as the number of cores increased, as we went from 10 to 12 to 20 to 26, the access latency increased and the bandwidth per core diminished. So Intel would mitigate this by essentially splitting the chip into two halves and then adding a second ring to reduce distances. And this invisible split, as I call it, it was something that needed to be factored into virtual apps and desktop sizing to provide optimal results. And this has been referred to in the past as NUMA, non-uniform memory access. And the leading guidance was to ensure that you're sizing XenApp VMs as large as possible, but not crossing those NUMA nodes or sub-NUMA clusters or rings at the same time. So if you sized your XenApp VMs too large and they effectively span NUMA nodes or rings, it could lead to what we call NUMA thrashing by accessing non-local resources. And that would yield reduced single server scalability. Fast forward to today, and Intel has moved from this ring-based architecture to a mesh-based architecture. And the new mesh architecture introduced in Skylake, it doesn't have the same limitations as before, where we have to split chips and divide cores or add rings. And this definitely changes the way we size virtual apps servers in particular. So it's very important to understand the specific chip that's being used in the hardware you purchase and how the underlying microprocessor architecture is designed and constructed. Okay, so that's probably a lot, but let me provide an example since that always helps. So if you run into a 20-core chip like I did a few months ago at a customer, it's not necessarily split into two NUMA nodes with 10 cores each anymore, and 10 vCPUs might not be the way to go for each of your XenApp servers. At this particular customer, we ended up actually deploying a 16 vCPU spec on a new 20-core gold chip with that mesh-based architecture, and the performance was outstanding. We got that linear, great performance that you'd expect. So it just goes to show you that what was the best practice even a year ago, might not be the best practice today. All right, so I mentioned 2016, and we're starting to see more of that in the field as customers upgrade from 2012 R2 to 2016. So I have a couple performance results here, and basically what we're doing is comparing 2012 R2 to 2016 using a Login VSI workload. And this first one was a study that Login VSI did, and they're basically showing you, I think, tuned on the left there versus clean, if you can read that. And basically that means tuned versus vanilla. And what they found was about an 8 to 15% decrease, when you move from 2012 R2 to 2016, which is kind of as expected. I think ever since I've started, as we moved from 2003 to 2008 to 2012, I've always said it's about a 10 to 15% hit to single server scalability. So that's pretty much expected there. And then we wanted to, kind of do our own internal test to validate this. And so we did a similar setup here in our Citrix engineering labs. Again, using the Login VSI, and we use the task worker workload. I think the previous one was the knowledge worker workload. And this is actually, running basically Office 2013 on VMware's hypervisor. So this is done on ESXi 6.0. And we found pretty much the same thing. So we looked at a couple different things. At the bottom there's a couple different graphs. We had some thin wire and enhancements or improvements we were testing too. But the net, it was about a 15% reduction in single server scalability. So pretty much, again, following that rule of thumb, as you move from 2012 to 2016, expect about a 15% hit. So of course, I just say that, and then I'm going to say that it's different as we move to 2019. So this is what really blew me away. So as soon as 2019 made its debut, Login VSI was one of the first ones to grab, that first RTM GA build. And they did some testing looking at 2016 now versus 2019. And they also looked at some Office versions, which is kind of cool, and you can kind of do the math there if you're interested in the Office scalability impact. But really, so I was keying in on the 2016 versus 2019 operating system differences. And what we found, just looking again at the OSs, taking kind of Office out of the equation, or using apples to apples there with Office the same, single server scalability was only reduced by 4%. which kind of blew me away. Because again, we always kind of expect 10 to 15%, and now we're actually single digits and less than 5%. So it looks like the impact, the jury's still out here because we haven't seen a lot of 2019 in the field yet, but the initial tests look really, really promising. All right, so I mentioned some of those HDX enhancements. So I picked the biggest one in my opinion, the most critical one in my opinion, which is EDT. So, in case folks aren't aware of this, we're now that bandwidth is a little bit more ubiquitous and it's all about user experience, and we're trying to make your user experience a little bit more interactive. We've essentially flipped the HDX protocol from going over TCP to going over UDP. So EDT is more than just UDP. It's kind of our own proprietary thing that has some reliability built into it. But for all intents and purposes, like if you look at it with Wireshark, on the network, it'll show up, resonate as UDP. And even in the code, some of the parameters you'll see like quote unquote HDX over UDP. So that's what EDT really is under the covers. But one of the things I wanted to look at was how does this impact? How does this switch from TCP to UDP impact single server scalability? So we looked at a bunch of different releases. So the first, I think, 3 there are current releases, 7.12, 7.14s, and some variations, right, of between Windows 7 and 2012. So desktop and server OSs, we wanted to look at both. And then the last one is the LTSR, so that's 7.15 on 2012 R2. And what we found was the single server scalability. So those are VSI max numbers right there. Might be a little tough to read, but what we found when you averaged it all out, it was about a 1.2% hit to scalability. So essentially negligible in this statistical world. And so that's because there's no real impact to CPU. And again, because CPU is our bottleneck, that actually directly translates to having no impact on triple S or single server scalability. So that's one I like to show people if they're considering moving to the kind of the next wave of HDX, which is based on EDT as of 7.16. All right, so here's a question I get a lot. As I mentioned at the start here, and we're living in this post kind of security, world, right, and post meltdown Spectre. How do all these things impact, single server scalability, or how do they change the rule of 5 and 10? So Citrix, Login VSI, other vendors, partners, we've done rounds and rounds of testing now since we've had about a year to put these through the paces, all the mitigations. And the mitigations are changing all the time too, by the way. But we've done both. We've looked at them in combined fashion, and we've also looked at them in isolated fashion to understand what hampers performance the most. And without question, Spectre and L1 terminal fault really hit us the hardest. And on the flip side, meltdown and bypass were pretty insignificant when it comes to single server scalability. So we're talking, single digits there. And to be clear, there are more than this, right? But I'm just providing a few popular examples, and every variant is different, right? Spectre 1, variant 1, variant 2. Just because like meltdown and Spectre came out around the same time, it doesn't mean they're anything like, or the risks are the same, or the mitigations are similar. They're all different animals, and each vulnerability and variant on top of it should be evaluated individually, by security teams and key business leaders. But anyway, back on topic, I find that ranges and examples from the real world always help. So I provided a best and a worst case scenario here that we've seen in the field firsthand, and not in a lab, again, to be clear. And you can see one of the popular deployment scenarios there with the latest XenApp LTSR on ESXi. So we're routinely seeing about a 25 to 30% hit to performance or single server scalability. All right, so I mentioned the CRs. So how do the latest, current releases, and there's been a lot of them, right, since the 7.15 LTSR, how do these impact, scalability? So first I wanted to show you the VDA side, and then I'll show you the host side. So on the VDA side, this is courtesy of Dan Feller here. I stole a picture from one of his latest articles. But on the VDA side, he's been looking at a variety of different profiles at the bottom there. You can see like task worker, with different profiles like, best for user experience or best for like the WAN or remote scenarios. And then each of the little bars actually represents a current release or the LTSR. And the LTSR is the gray one in the middle. It's pretty much dead center. And as you can see, the CPU usage from like that LTSR 7.15 to like the latest release, 18.11, or even 19.03 that we just shipped is really the same there as 18.11. It's almost been cut in half, which is amazing. So that's the VDA side, and I just wanted to point that out, that that's something we're working on every single release, is minimizing that VDA CPU footprint. And then if you look at the host side, so now we're looking at single server scalability, and we're doing the same thing. This is courtesy of ICTR, some of the login consultant folks. They're seeing about, they kind of saw the same thing. We looked at it internally, and they kind of proved it, and this is kind of a nice independent resource, but they saw like a 31% improvement between the last LTSR, so again 7.15, and like 18.11.1 or 1903, our latest CR. And so again, that's an amazing savings. Just we're talking about a year and a half basically of releases there. So some really cool stuff. If you're going to the latest CR, you can expect to gain some of that performance back that maybe you lost with applying like a Spectre Variant 2 patch or mitigation. All right. So the last thing I wanted to address was how the rule of 5 and 10 are stacking up in the real world against real apps and workloads. And I'll focus on the virtual apps or Zen app space for a minute, because it's the most popular use case we still see today, and we also have the most data there by far. And so I looked at 12 real-world deployments over the last year, and I averaged all the results. And so you can see like a snapshot of just one of the real customers there. So I looked at 12 of these, and I put them all together. And so what does it end up kind of being, the magic number? 9.2. And originally, so by the way, just to be transparent with everybody, I did this probably 2 years ago, and it was more like 11. And then I did this, I think, about 6 months ago, and it was 9.83. And so here we are with 4 or 5 more kind of real data sets, and we're kind of down to 9.2. So it is trending down. And so let me explain this a minute, this 9.2 number. So we found, you may have noticed this on one of the last slides, but we found that only about half of the customers have applied all the security mitigations to date. So that right there is probably keeping the number a little bit artificially high. And I'm not going to go on record saying that's the right approach or you shouldn't patch. I'm just pointing out a very interesting finding or trend as we looked at the real world deployments in the enterprise space. And the other reasons why we believe this number is hanging around 9 or 10 is simply because I think prior to 2018, as I mentioned, the magic multiplier had actually crept up to 11 or 12. And this was due to advances in Intel processors, hypervisor CPU schedulers were getting better. We saw more folks using Citrix Optimizer now that it became the tool. And even technologies like WEM, right, are all helping. But as I've shown in the last few slides, the latest CRs have improved, in performance, and they're driving these numbers back up. So if you factor in maybe a 25 to 30% hit for security, that 11 or 12 number a year ago might actually be more like 9, as you see here today. So anyways, I think it's hanging right around 10, and it's maybe it's trending down, and maybe it'll go down a little bit more. If you actually look at LTSR releases, which is I think where the majority of our large footprints are out there, it's actually creeping down to more like 8. But overall, I think once more people start deploying CRs or the next LTSR is out, I think you'll see this number actually go back from 8 up to 10 again. So anyways, maybe a future outlook there. All right, so now I want to kind of change gears and talk about the cloud. And the first thing I want to say when we're talking about cloud and scalability is that rule of 5 and 10, unfortunately, doesn't apply here. So now we're kind of it's a black box. When we're in Azure or GCP or AWS, it's we can't really see the underlying host, and we can't dictate things like CPU over subscription ratios 2 to 1. We can't do that. And so I just want to be clear that the rule of 5, 10 don't really apply here. So the first slide I want to show is kind of what we thought about 3 years ago in 2016, and then what we think today, or what we know today. So in 2016, I wrote an article actually at the bottom there that the author was myself, unfortunately, that scaling out with smaller VMs or smaller VM specs was the way to go. And this was all based on Login VSI testing and using the latest Microsoft, Google, in AWS at the time cost models. What we found was basically in Azure, the standard, the D2, like the general purpose D series, those were the best bang for your buck. And really, if you look at the VM specs, it was 2 vCPUs there in the Azure world. So that's what I mean by scale out, like really small, a lot of smaller VMs. And then in AWS, it was really these T2s or these C3 extra larges. And if again, those were 2 or 4 vCPU spec boxes, right? Very, very small. And so that was what we were saying to everybody back then was, kind of go with these D series in Azure and go small and scale out. Well, we looked at that in kind of, I think it was mid to late 2018. And what we found was we started looking at knowing that CPU was the bottleneck, we started looking at the F series a little bit harder, because the F series is kind of the new compute optimized series based on Skylake. And we found that, when we, again, did the math with Login VSI, we're looking at not only, single server scalability, but then cost. And I'll show you kind of how you look at that in a minute in a nice picture. But we found that the F series was winning out. And not only the F series was beating the D, but the bigger F series. And what I mean by that is the F8s and the F16s, those were winning out. And in the AWS world, the 2x larges, so I think it's the 8 vCPU spec, that was winning out in the AWS world. And similarly in Google, now we were looking at GCP, and one of our CTPs, Paul Stansel, actually looked at this and published a good article on Citrix blogs. He also found that those N1 standard 8s and the N1 standard 16s, those were the best sweet spot. And again, those are using 8 or 16 vCPUs, just like that F16 on the Azure world. So those are winning out, and now we're recommending scaling up, with those larger instance sizes, if that makes sense. So anyways, there's a blog there at the bottom that Kevin Nardone wrote that kind of goes into detail, a little bit more detail of what I just said, if you want to check it out. And so again, there's two things we look at, right? So not only the host or the user density, but we look at the cost. So first, it's important, right, to do this and to see, all right, so you stack all these different D and F series instance types against each other, and what is the VSI max, right? So what's the user density? So I know it's a little bit hard to read, but the last two there is a D16, that's a version 3 series, and then there's the F16, so that's a standard version 2 series. And so, and then the two things there are basically task worker and knowledge worker, the blue and the orange. And so that's great. That's one piece of it, but so this doesn't necessarily mean that like the D or the F is the best just because they have the most users, because you need to do this. You need to actually look at the cost, for each of those different instance types and do the math, basically do some, straight kind of easy division. And what you see here is the F16 V2 sort of wins out. So right about, a little under, I think it's 2 cents an hour there. That's the cost per user per hour. So that's being the lowest here is actually the best now, right, when you look at it from a cost perspective. So again, just showing you that the old kind of recommendation of the D2 is actually, I think it's the one on the far left there. Yeah, the D2. It might be the highest if you're looking at task workers like in a XenApp scenario. That might be the worst case scenario to pick in terms of, looking at the cost or the price. And so now our favorite is the far right there. So it's those larger, 16 vCPUs and 32 gigs of RAM is essentially what that standard F16 V2 is. So hopefully that makes sense. The last question we get on cloud is, okay, so that all sounds great, Nick. We'll go with these larger Fs, but like, should we, go with kind of pay as you go, like an on demand, in the AWS world, or do we go with like reserved instances? And like, what's the sweet spot between, where I should go reserved instances or say pay as you go? And really what we found, so here's a few different examples. I won't read these all off. But yeah, it definitely depends. But here's I guess the key finding we found it depends on is if you're going to leave your VMs on, for about 17 hours a day. So if you're going to have 17 plus hours of uptime, an action a day, then going with reserved instances is definitely the way to go. There's like a break-even point there we found, and that's in the Azure world, by the way. But it's all kind of relatively the same across the major public clouds. But so then if you're doing under that, so say you're doing 16 hours or less a day, so maybe you're in one of those, kind of peak, off-peak scenarios, and maybe you can drain users, more effectively, then it does make sense to introduce some things like autoscale, right, that are built into the XenApps and desktop service now, to maybe drain users and power those things off and then get some cost savings back. So anyways, that's kind of what we've learned is that 16, 17-hour sweet spot. That's where I think it makes it's at least the tipping point right now. And again, there's other factors, right? There's discounts. There's, you can do 1 and 3 year kind of deals. So there's more to this. But I think with all things being equal, that's kind of the net is it makes sense to do pay as you go if you're kind of not going to be very active or using those servers for more than 16, 17 hours a day. Otherwise, just go RI and just be done with it. The last slide I have here is something that's kind of really brand new and hot off the press. So talking about cloud and scalability, this just kind of came to mind. So I added a slide here. So if you're doing a Citrix Cloud deployment, and let's say you got all your kind of your virtual apps and desktop instances all dialed in. So you're using F16s, let's say in Azure, and then you deploy the gateway service. So this is the Citrix Gateway Service in the cloud. So we're hosting this for you. So what do you do about those cloud connectors? Because if you've done a big deployment on Citrix Cloud, you've probably noticed that those kind of can be a bottleneck, right around 1,000 or 1,200 HDX sessions per connector. So it's not a lot, right? So if you're doing 5,000 or 10,000 user deployment, we probably need a little bit better solution. So we finally came up with that better solution, and it's called Rendezvous. And so instead of kind of scaling up or out with those connectors, like having 10 of those or 20 of those, or trying to bump the VM specs up, what we recommend doing is basically going around that connector. So now Rendezvous, if you flip this, it's a policy there, and I have a little screenshot. But if you flip this on, what it does is the VDA establishes a connection to the gateway service directly. So it doesn't actually proxy through the cloud connector. So this just G8 on the gateway side, and also on the virtual apps and desktop side, the catch is you have to use 1811 plus. So if you're using 1811 or 1903, this will automatically work by default right out of the box. And then I have a couple links there at the bottom that go into kind of some of the prereqs. And then Dan Feller has a really good kind of network connectivity kind of chart showing you what exactly happens and all the ports and things like that. So check those out. All right, so wrapping things up here, some of the key takeaways before we open it up for live Q&A. The rule of 5 and 10, I think maybe it's the rule of 4 and 8 today. Again, like I said, if you're using maybe LTSR, have some hungrier apps, maybe it's starting to trend down to 9. But I think it still definitely applies. It's absolutely fantastic for a quick estimate of single server scalability, and definitely better than nothing. But if you want to know your true number, right, if you want to know it's 10.1 or 7.6 or maybe it is 9.2, then, use Login VSI. It is the tool. It's the tool that all of us use, right, in the industry. So whether it's Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, we all use it. And it's a fantastic, and that's the only way to really, really know your magic number, magic multiplier. As I mentioned before, Spectre and L1 terminal fault, those definitely have the most significant impact on single server scalability. So, might be talking double digits right there. With each of those mitigations. And then the latest Intel chips and the Citrix current releases, maybe those are the things that are going to get you back that scalability. So I think both of those kind of negate each other, which is nice. About 25 to 30% each, as I showed. The other thing too, all the latest HDX enhancements, right? I showed kind of EDT having no impact on CPU. And therefore no impact on single server scalability. The other ones too there, like fuzzy first, progressive display, they also don't impact CPU. I didn't show you kind of slides with all the details, but you can kind of take my word for it. And then don't forget about Citrix Optimizer. That's definitely, Martin Zuzek is putting a ton of time into that, and so is the community, and it's getting better and better with every release. So always make sure to kind of grab the latest and greatest, and 2.1 being the latest and greatest right now. And then when you're going cloud, definitely think twice. So, whereas before I mentioned that we were recommending, those kind of the smaller D series in a scale out fashion, well, now we're recommending, scaling up and larger F series in the Azure world. And then also, I think definitely understand how your users are using, the, applications, the servers. It's really important to understand that active versus idle ratio and how how active, I guess, or how long those VMs are going to be powered on, because there is a tipping point between going reserved instances and pay as you go. And it's, again, from our analysis right now, this is definitely subject to change, every week. It's about 17 hours is that break even point. And as always, tune, test, and test some more. So I think that's that kind of wraps it up. If you like this kind of scalability stuff or performance stuff, this is exactly what we're going to be doing at the VDI Performance Summit, hosted by Login VSI actually on May 2nd. I'm going to be actually talking at that. I have a session. and it's going to be completely new content. It won't be anything kind of related to this. It'll be fresh new content. And then there's some other folks, there that are also presenting. So Martin also from Citrix, Ruben. So some really, they've put together a star-studded cast, and I'm excited to be able to speak at that event in just a couple weeks here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick and Mark. And don't forget to take advantage of the 10% discount on your next Citrix education purchase. And then also be sure to join us on August 15th for the Next Tips event, which is going to feature actually Ryan McClure and George Caruvula. So I think it's going to be a great event talking about putting hybrid rights to work for you so you can really maximize those benefits. So without further ado, we can head on into the live Q&A.
Thanks, Michelle. This is Nick here again. It looks like we have a few good questions in the queue already, which is great, and I'll just divvy them up as we go here. And if you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A pane, and we'll receive those questions in real time here. And if for some reason we don't get to your question or I accidentally skip it, we'll either follow up directly with you after the webinar, or we'll put together an FAQ and publish it on Citrix blogs like we've done before if there's a lot of questions. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce one other panelist that joined Mark and I a minute ago. His name is Rich Meesters, and he's our lead enterprise architect in Canada. Rich is one of our cloud gurus, and he might know GCP, Azure, and Citrix Cloud better than anyone at Citrix. So excited to have Rich here. And he also has a lot of big customers in his patch, so feel free to ask him any design or scalability question as well.
Thanks,
all
Nick.
right. Yeah. So let's get to that first question. Can I mix reserved instances and pay-as-you-go for my workloads and infrastructure? Rich, do you want to grab that one?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Absolutely, you can. In fact, we tend to see customers do that. You really have needs for reserved instances for things like your control infrastructure anyway, because it's going to be running 24 hours a day. And generally, we want to split that up as kind of a base set of applications and instances that are going to be running for those longer periods of time, as Nick mentioned during the presentation, as well as some that are shorter running. So reserved instances are done generally by the type of instance you have. It's not specific instances, so you can reserve a bunch, have a bunch pay as you go, and then use autoscale to manage those instances as you go along.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Next question here. Does the single server scalability discussed here scale linearly? So could I simply extrapolate those results for other types of servers or components? Mark, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. It's always the question of it depends. I was having some latency on the line here, which is also great doing this webinar over a long distance. But do you see this question a lot in practice? I would ask Nick.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, everyone's always asking. Okay, so now we see it's like this rule is great, and XenApp that makes sense, or Zen Desktop. But what about like other infrastructure components like SQL or whatever? Does the same rules apply, or what do we do there? How do we test it?
Yeah. So I'm really an expert on VDI. When it comes to SQL, it really depends on the workload. So if you're just crunching numbers, if you're doing big data, you're probably going to use 99% of the CPU or GPU of whatever it's in there. And it's not really relevant how that scales. So I would say for other systems, the rule doesn't really apply.
Okay. Perfect, thanks. Next question here. A lot of this content's been on CPU. What about memory and disk? Yeah, let me take that one. Yeah, I mean the reason we're so I'm always I say almost obsessed with CPU. And all we talk about these oversubscription ratios of like 2 to 1. That's kind of the sweet spot for XenApp or virtual apps. And the reason why is because as I mentioned in the webinar, it's the CPU is the limiting factor, the bottleneck, probably in like 99% of the scenarios. So, yes, I mean, we've certainly run into scenarios where memory can be the bottleneck. But if you do some quick kind of, sizing exercises using like the rule of 5 and 10, you usually can buy enough memory so it's not a problem. And these days, memory's kind of cheap compared to CPU. So CPU just tends to be the bottleneck, and that's why we talk about it so much. So with that being said, memory, it doesn't tend to be the bottleneck, and with the operating system going from 2008 to 2012 to 2016, we see that there's a result in a drop in memory usage from an OS perspective. And disk, it also tends not to be a bottleneck, although with certain caveats. We often recommend single image management technology like PVS or MCS. And each of them, they both have features to significantly drop the disk I/O, like the write cache and RAM with buffer overflow, or on the MCS side, the MCS I/O technology, optimization technology. So that's why we talk a lot about CPU. Not to say that memory or disk, can't be the bottleneck, but CPU is, I'd say 99% of the time. All right, next question here. So Romit asked, fuzzy first enhancements, does it help reduce bandwidth and improve performance in an HDX session? So yeah, that's the fuzzy first. I think it's really the feature we're talking about there is the build to lossless. So we changed it in 7.18, I want to say. Yeah, 7.18. So we used to, when we built to lossless, we used to use JPEG. And what we're doing now with fuzzy first, or build to lossless in 7.18, is we're instead of using that JPEG variable image quality, we're using H.264. And so where this really comes into play, and so again, what we're doing here is it's going to look fuzzy at first. So the picture, so we're going to give you better interactivity, and it might be the image might be fuzzy at first, but then we're going to snap as soon as we have, what we're looking for, I guess. We're going to snap and build the lossless, and it's going to be really, really quick with H.264 versus JPEG. And where this really comes into play is in those, limited bandwidth scenarios or high latency scenarios. So if you're like, again, 100 to kind of 300 millisecond range, let's say, or low bandwidth, that's when we actually get some gains on the bandwidth side, which I think he was asking about there. But really, we're on the LAN, it might not make much of a difference. It's probably the same, but on those WAN scenarios, it's definitely going to make a difference, and we'll save some bandwidth. And honestly, the whole point is the interactivity is better across the board. So that's what it's all about. All right, next question here. Do we have any, Zishan was asking, do we have any max VMs per server limit? Should we take care of? No, we don't. It's certainly nothing that I'm aware of, in terms of single server scalability on a given host. The most I've seen in the wild, I'll tell you too, is about 750. We did about 750 sessions it was XenApp on a pretty beefy host there, one of the newer Intel boxes. And yeah, running a popular healthcare application. So that's kind of what we've seen in the wild. But it's funny. I think just maybe 3-4 years ago, the max I'd seen was probably like 450 or 500 in the wild. So we're inching toward that 1,000 users per host kind of threshold, which is pretty amazing. But yeah, nothing. It's pretty much just resources bottlenecks at this point. So yeah, Mark, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, so it's mostly for me about how big do you want to create a single point of failure? What if that host goes down, right? Or if you need to move your users to another box, suddenly with 700, it's a whole lot. So ideally, I'd segment them out maybe a little bit smaller, depending on the use case.
Yeah, it's funny. So I was just having this like a philosophical future kind of discussion around sizing and scalability. So let's say later this year, early next year, we're going to have these new Intel boxes, these advanced performance boxes I mentioned. They might have 56 cores, right? And so we're going to be, let's say, over that 1,000, user threshold. So you're absolutely right, Mark. Do we want to put, and with the mesh architecture, as I mentioned too, do we want to have just 4 VMs, let's say, on one of these hosts, and each VM, each virtual machine hosts, let's say, 250 users? That's a big, failure domain. And so some customers, that I've worked with, they like to keep that maybe under 100. I've seen some say 60, and this all depends. So it's going to be more about, I think, operational aspects and business aspects versus like technical limitations. So the future is going to be kind of crazy. We might see a few more VMs on a box than maybe is optimal classically, I'd say. And people actually tweaking those numbers down to reduce the failure domain. So interesting stuff there, Mark.
Absolutely.
Next question here from Roman again. Citrix Optimizer 2.1. What are the new changes brought up in this new version? Rich, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, Nick. So with 2.1, there's not a lot of new optimization features there. It's mostly bug fixes and some usability enhancements, such as the ability to remove the third-party marketplaces that were added in 2.0, some more detailed reporting and some contextual help and tips within the product as well. If you want to see more detail on exactly what was added in 2.1, Martin Zugek did a great blog just a couple of weeks ago called on Citrix blogs called Citrix Optimizer 2.1 What's New. So I encourage you to Google that and take a look at all the details.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Got another one here for you. Will Azure preferred or Amazon as a cloud service with future Citrix products? So maybe asking which preferred cloud vendor choice.
And we don't have a preferred provider. I mean, Citrix has always been based on like any hypervisor, any cloud in terms of being able to deliver the solutions. So whether it's Azure, Amazon, GCP, as public cloud instances, we pretty much cover all of those and are adding features to all of them as we progress along to bring the usability up. And in addition, we're also, starting to look at some of the other clouds like Oracle Cloud. And of course, we work with any other sort of semi-public cloud that provide a hypervisor link.
Yep, perfect. Thanks, Rich. Here's a question, looks like from one of your friends in the Netherlands, Mark. So, and I get this one all the time, by the way, when I talk about the rule of 5 and 10. So GPUs, what's the impact of GPU on the rule of 5 and 10?
So yeah, the Netherlands is absolutely a small country. Thanks for that, Nick. So I do absolutely know Nico. So it's a good question. I don't think the rule applies. It's simple. There's a lot of scalability questions coming into our mailbox every day about how it sizes and scales. But honestly, it really depends on the applications. Could be the rule of 1 or 2, but it really depends on the applications and how you're using them. Typically, I focus on the frame buffer, right? So keep an eye on that. You know how much of that you're giving away per user. That determines your scalability. It's no longer the CPU. It's probably looking at how much GPU memory you have, and that tells you something.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I've got a couple more for you here. Actually, there's 2 that I'll try to combine from Luke and Linus here. So how is Login VSI licensed? What's the pricing of Login VSI Max? Probably just talking Login VSI there. And what are the hardware requirements? Do you want to cover that, Mark?
Yeah, so a good question about the licensing. So we basically look at the amount of users you have on your environment. So it's very similar to Citrix licensing. Pricing, it depends. So, what sort of environment you want to have, what type of subscription you want to have. So I can connect you with some details after the webinar. I'm happy to do that. And as far as the hardware requirements, they depend as well. So for VSI, if you want to do load testing, you just need a file share. If you want to keep a few of those virtual user guys working 24/7, we've got a really neat virtual appliance that you can just turn on and it will test your environment all the time from different locations. So, on the requirements, a couple gigabytes of memory and 2 vCPUs, but it's really small.
Perfect. Thanks. Next question here. Question to Rich from Shiva. What's the recommended provisioning model for virtual desktops and apps, MCS, PBS, et cetera? What do you see the most in enterprise environments?
Yeah, well, we tend to see PBS the most in enterprise environments. It's been around the longest. It's particularly for the XenApp workloads, and we tend to see a lot of enterprises use it. The gap in terms of using PBS versus MCS is narrowing somewhat. There are still some enterprise features there in PBS that haven't quite made it to MCS around versioning and rollback, but they're catching up pretty quick. So we're starting to see more of a mix of both PBS and MCS depending upon the customer size, their investment, what their network looks like, and really what they're trying to do.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Question here from Leandro. What what should you recommend? 20 Citrix servers with, it looks like 4 vCPU and 8 gig of RAM, or 10 Citrix servers, 8 vCPUs, 16 gig of RAM? Okay, yeah, so kind of the, do we go with kind of the higher spec machine, scale out or scale up question? So good question. I hate to say it depends, but it does. I mean, first, again, if there's NUMA considerations, like if you're if you have older Intel chips that have that ring architecture, then yeah, you might be forced to go with that, 4 vCPU spec, let's say, right? If you're on an 8 or some, 16 core machine, maybe that's best to again ensure linear scalability. But these days, let's assume you have a new Intel chip, a new box you just bought, and it has a mesh architecture, and you really don't have those considerations. I just prefer to go bigger. We're doing more and more 8 vCPU, but it's like, why even stop there? We're doing 16 vCPU implementations all the time now, and again, so that's on-prem. In the cloud, those F16s, which is a 16 vCPU spec, we're doing those left and right. That's like the recommended spec that's winning out, even in terms of price. So I would challenge you to go bigger. Less VMs to manage, right? Maybe less licensing. Maybe you can save some costs on licensing. But yeah, don't even stop there with 10 Citrix servers. Could you go to 5 with a 16 vCPU spec? Again, it all comes down to what Mark and I were talking about earlier, kind of the sweet spot between performance and manageability, right? You don't want to probably have 2 VMs, with that are huge, hosting a lot of users. But maybe, yeah, the sweet spot there is between 5 to 10 Citrix servers, and that the spec ends up being 8 to 16 vCPUs. So that's kind of what I'd recommend is scaling up where you can. Next question here. What's the recommended Azure machine type for Windows 10 VDI? Nico was asking. Rich, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So there's not a recommendation for Windows 10 VDI at this point in time anyway. We're looking at really what is the best instance type for the workload that you're going to run. So you're going to look at it more from a point of view of how the workload, what resources the workload needs in terms of particularly vCPU and RAM. That will be your determining factor for picking your workloads for Windows 10 VDI. The new multi-user Windows 10 will probably change that game, but I think the jury's out at this point yet in terms of how size and scale that.
Great. Thanks, Rich. Next one here. So Chris was asking, if users publish desktops on XenApp, should you expect the same number of users per box that you would seeing if just using published apps? So yeah, we get this one a lot. This is kind of the seamless question, right? Published apps or sub-published desktops. At the end of the day, let's assume you're doing the exact same workflow. Then yes, there's no difference. We have basically a seamless little piece of code there that pops out, an application. But behind the scenes, make no mistake, it's basically a virtualized server OS. So it's the same load. Now, when I say that, so again, rule of 10, it should be the same. However, most of the times when we find people doing published desktops, they're using a little bit more functionality. So they're just doing a little bit more, right, versus published app, which makes sense. Published app is a very singular thing. And so that's where you might see in reality, because the workload's different, maybe it's rule of 8 there for published desktop versus a rule of 10. So, but all things being equal, like the technology, it's absolutely the same, make no mistake. But in reality, I find people actually use those, differently. So that's where you might see a little bit less density on the published desktop side, but yeah. Bill was asking, would Citrix WEM make a significant impact to CPU usage in Windows 10 desktops? Rich or Mark, any comments on that one, on WEM?
Yeah, I think it can. It depends a little bit upon how you tune, and you have to be careful with some of the CPU tuning in WEM that it affects individual instances of an application. So you want to, obviously do your testing there. The challenge with WEM is some of the scalability testing that you do is something you have to look at over time. And so the kind of short-term testing that you're doing with Login VSI doesn't necessarily pick that up.
Yeah, we do, but WEM does have some really cool kind of CPU limiting and clamping features, which can make a difference. It's some of the technology really that's been around, a long time with some of these things like AppSense, and even we've had it in the Citrix product, for a while, the CPU optimization feature. So it can definitely make a difference. with some of those runaway applications or applications that steal a lot of CPU cycles from other users or processes on the box. Let's see. So Dean was asking, there's a project to migrate 6.5 to 7.15 in a large corp. Okay, so it includes upgrading 2008 to 2016 and desktops from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Other than CPU, memory, and SAN, high performance SAN, what else should be carefully considered before deciding on migration? Mark,
It's a very complex. It's a very complex question. There's actually a lot of sub questions in there, and Dean is even apologizing for the maybe the question is too simple. Well, it's actually a very complex question, so a good one. Break it into pieces, right? There are different projects, right? Move 6.5 to 7.15. That's a big thing when it comes to the Citrix architecture, right? 2008 R2. To 2016, you might be running into some 32 to 64-bit application problems. Same with Windows 7 to Windows 10. So that's something to consider. Really application compatibility, but also things like, hey, if you're running antivirus now, will that work in the future? Do I have other memory requirements? Because Windows 7 is a lot lighter than Windows 10 when it comes to that, especially if you go to the later releases like 1809. For example. So there's plenty to discover there, but I try to break it up maybe in little pieces, because if you try to do all of this at one time, you can do it, but it's a very big project. Ideally, I'd break it up into smaller pieces to have successes earlier on.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. Let's go back. Shiva has another one. How does the provisioning model, MCS link clones, full clone, PVS, affect the scalability of a server? Rich, you want to take that one?
Yep, sorry, just coming off mute. Primarily the focus there is going to be on scalability of your storage subsystem when you're taking a look at the write cache functionality that's available in MCS or PVS. You will have to take into consideration when you do that the amount of memory that you're giving the individual machines to host that write cache and system cache on the server instances themselves. But it's not going to play a large role in terms of CPU, which is going to be where most of your bottleneck is going to be for your server-based computing workloads. So really here, probably looking at more of a storage optimization than anything else.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Here's a good one from Chris. So if you say the normal, rule there, 5 of 10 rule, so with 2x18 CPU, you get 360 users on a host for XenApp. So what does that actually look like in terms of XenApp VDA servers? Do you recommend lots of smaller VDAs or few larger ones? So how do you decide to go with that? Yeah, so I think I covered this in some previous discussions and talks and stuff. We didn't really go over it today, but so what I typically do is, just like you did, the first math there is if you want to kind of, do a quick estimate of density is 2x18, so that's, basically 36, physical cores, as you said there, times it by 10, so you get 360. But how do you actually carve up, the VMs on that server? So the most important thing there, let's assume that hyperthreading's on. So you basically use, 72 is kind of the magic number there. And that's basically 36 times 2, so 72, and that's the CPU oversubscription ratio, that I would use for XenApp. So then you just do the math and try to come up with, number of XenApp VMs with the VPU spec that equals 72. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But like, give you an example, if you decide that a 9 vCPU spec is the way to go, I'm just throwing that out there, then I would go with 8. So 9 times 8 being 72. So I go with 8, VDAs or VMs per host, and that's that. So that gives you that 2-to-1 oversubscription ratio. That's kind of the sweet spot that we found in kind of a lot of real world testing. But again, you could go higher if you decide to go with a 10 vCPU spec or 12 or 16, let's say. Just make sure that the math adds up to 72. So you conform to that 2-to-1 CPU oversubscription ratio. So hopefully that makes sense, Chris. I published if you want to read more about that, I published a lot of articles on Citrix blogs about that over the last like 5-6 years. If you Google like Citrix scalability, part 1, part 2, I kind of talk about the oversubscription ratio and give a few more examples. Here's another one. One more. Yeah, there's a lot of big hardware vendors are advising GPUs for regular Office workloads, mainly because of the increased graphical use of Windows 10 in Office. What's your opinion about that? So another question from Nico here. Mark, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. So my personal opinion, for Office, it's quite expensive. It does influence. I mean, Office has hardware acceleration, so there is something to be said for that. But with looking at the current market, personally, I do not think you absolutely need them for that, because it can also heavily impact the scalability of the rest of your system. So if you put some M10s in a server, let's say you can put 3 in a server if you have a big one, and you give each user 1 GB frame buffer in a VDI scenario, that puts you at 96 users for the box. While probably when you look at CPU, there's a little bit more scalability to get from it. So just from that perspective, I don't think you per se need them. However, there are, of course, applications and use cases where they are very useful.
All right. Last question here from Naveen. We use Linux VDA. What else has improved? Rich, do you want to comment on that? Not sure exactly what Naveen's going with there, but maybe just some of the latest enhancements or something.
Yeah, I was looking at that question and kind of struggling with it as well. I think there's been a number of recent graphical enhancements with the VDA. I don't have a ton of detail on it, so I'm not sure exactly how to answer that one, Nick.
Okay, we can follow up there. Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah,
sure
let's follow up on that one.
Yeah, especially around single server scalability and Linux VDA. I haven't seen any numbers, but we can follow up with you, Naveen.
Yeah, I don't think we've done any specific testing on scalability for sure on the Linux VDA side.
Yeah, I haven't seen any. Last question here, it looks like in the queue, and then I think we're done with all 23 of these or so. Robert was asking, how easy is it to upgrade? I think maybe he's asking, how easy is it to upgrade Citrix? Maybe just a kind of general question. Do you want to talk about maybe VDA and controller kind of upgrade process, Rich?
Yeah, sure. So I did notice also that he had asked about, if there's articles, and Nick, you did mention like the number of scalability blogs that you've done over the past few years. So that'd be a great source to go and take a look at. In terms of upgrading, there's not a lot of coding required. I think that was part of the question that was there. It's a lot of click-through installs, obviously. We do have 2 parts, really. I mean, if you look at the control infrastructure and you look at the VDAs are pretty easy to upgrade. It's an agent that's installed on the machines, and it's a pretty straightforward code update there, just to Windows for the Windows VMs anyway. And then on the controller side, we're really looking at a combination of typically database and database schema updates that are done in order to add new functionality, as well as the coding updates that are done on the Windows servers that are the controllers. And then other components like Storefront and Director, again, they're pretty simple, straightforward Windows update type of updates to the environment.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. And yeah, Robert, in terms of more resources, I think the Citrix Tech Zone, it's kind of our latest and greatest kind of version of Microsoft TechNet. It's where we're putting all of our best practices and things like that. But if you Google Citrix TechNet and then like single server scalability, there's a whole design section under Citrix Tech Zone that has, different kind of design, kind of best practices types of articles and things like that. And one of the ones I just actually wrote up was on single server scalability. So definitely, good plain English there, good resource you can reference. But I just in general, since Tech Zone is really only a few months old, just a good resource that everyone should probably bookmark. And actually, we just came out with an RSS feed, I want to say, just about 2 weeks ago. So you can kind of be notified of any of the new reference architectures and design updates that way. And with that looks like it's it. So, yeah, again, if we happen to miss your question, we'll either follow up with you directly or we'll put together an FAQ. But I think we got to most of them, so that might not be necessary this time. But thanks again for tuning in, and I know we're well over, but lots of questions, which is great. Happy to take those. But we appreciate your time today. Talk to everyone later. Bye.